Darius is an ordinary 8th grader, but when he becomes the target of relentless bullying by Zach, things quickly spiral out of control. As the pressure mounts, Darius faces a tough choice: stand his ground or give in to anger. His decisions could change not only his life, but how others see him. Can he rise above the conflict, or will he be pulled into a fight that threatens to consume him? Want to find out what happens? Leave a comment and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. It was the kind of day that should have been ordinary. The autumn sun cast long golden rays through the suburban streets of Easton as kids hurried out of school and filled the sidewalks with chatter and laughter. Darius Morgan, a 14-year-old 8th grader at Hamilton Middle School, walked home with his best friend Ethan Garcia. They were talking about the upcoming basketball season. Well, Ethan was doing most of the talking. Darius was only half listening, his thoughts tangled in a mixture of nerves and excitement. He had just handed in his big history essay, and for the first time in a long while, he felt good about something he'd written. "I'm telling you, bro, this is our year," Ethan said, nudging Darius's shoulder with a grin. "I've been working on my jump shot all summer. We're gonna dominate the court." Darius smiled, though his mind was still on the essay. Mr. Dawson, their history teacher, was notoriously strict, and Darius had spent hours working on his paper about the civil rights movement. He'd carefully researched key figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, drawing connections between their work and the continuing fight for racial equality today. It was a subject that mattered deeply to him, more than just another homework assignment. His father, Greg Morgan, was a well-known civil rights attorney, and Darius had grown up hearing stories about his dad's cases and the injustices he fought against. This essay was a small way for Darius to contribute to that legacy. "Yeah, maybe," Darius replied, finally pulling his attention back to the conversation. "But you know, Coach still thinks I'm too quiet. I've got to start speaking up more on the court if I want any playing time." "Man, forget that," Ethan said, waving his hand dismissively. "You let your game speak for itself. Besides, you've got the skills. Coach will see that eventually." They reached the corner where they usually split up. Ethan lived 2 blocks over, but Darius's house was just down the street. "Catch you later?" Ethan asked, already backing away with a basketball in hand. "Yeah, see you tomorrow," Darius said, raising a hand in farewell. As Darius continued the walk home, the weight of the history essay pressed on him again. He couldn't shake the feeling of anticipation, mixed with anxiety, that came from waiting to hear back from Mr. Dawson. His teacher wasn't known for handing out praise easily. More often than not, his feedback was biting, bordering on harsh. Darius knew Mr. Dawson expected a lot from his students, especially from someone like him. That last thought lingered in his mind as he turned into his driveway. Someone like him. Darius had always been aware of the subtle, sometimes invisible barriers that came with being one of the few black kids in a predominantly white school. It wasn't that anyone was outright hostile, at least not openly, but there was always this undercurrent, this expectation that Darius had to work twice as hard to be seen as just as good. Inside the house, the familiar sounds of his mother, Lisa, in the kitchen brought a sense of comfort. The scent of something baking, probably her famous cornbread, filled the air. Darius dropped his backpack by the door, kicked off his sneakers, and wandered into the kitchen. "How was school?" Lisa asked without looking up from the oven, where she was carefully testing the cornbread with a toothpick. "Fine," Darius replied, though his voice sounded flat even to his own ears. Lisa glanced over at him, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You sure? You look like you've got something on your mind." Darius hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "Nah, just thinking about my history essay. Mr. Dawson's gonna give it back tomorrow, and I'm kind of nervous." "Don't be," Lisa said, her tone firm but kind. You worked hard on that. Whatever grade he gives you, just know that you did your best. Yeah, I know, Darius mumbled, though he wasn't entirely convinced. He grabbed an apple from the counter and headed upstairs to his room, where he spent the rest of the evening trying to focus on his homework, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Mr. Dawson's looming judgment. The next day at school, Darius's stomach twisted with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. He tried to keep his head down and focus on his other classes, but his mind was constantly drawn to fourth period history with Mr. Dawson. By the time he walked into the classroom, his palms were sweating. The classroom buzzed with the usual low hum of pre-class chatter, and Darius took his seat near the back, next to Ethan. He tried to appear casual, like he wasn't thinking about the essay, but Ethan noticed his tension. Relax, bro, Ethan said, sensing Darius's unease. You're gonna crush it. You always do. Darius smiled faintly, but didn't respond. Mr. Dawson entered the room, his usual stern expression in place as he carried a stack of graded essays. The room quieted as he began handing them back one by one, offering brief comments to each student. Darius's heart pounded as the stack got smaller and smaller. Finally, Mr. Dawson reached his desk and wordlessly handed him the paper. For a moment, Darius didn't move. He stared at the paper face down on his desk, afraid to flip it over. When he finally gathered the courage to look, his eyes went straight to the top right corner, where the grade was usually written, a C+. Darius blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected an A, but a C+. His heart sank. He flipped through the pages looking for feedback. There were the usual red marks, grammar corrections, comments about structure, but it was the final note, scrawled in red ink at the bottom of the last page, that made Darius's stomach churn. With your background, this is expected. He read the sentence again, then again. His throat tightened as he tried to process what he was seeing. With your background? What did that even mean? The words seemed to burn on the page, each one a knife twisting deeper into his gut. At first, Darius tried to tell himself that it was just a mistake, that maybe he was reading too much into it. Maybe Mr. Dawson meant something else, something about his academic background or his previous grades. But deep down, Darius knew better. He knew exactly what Mr. Dawson meant. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but Darius barely heard it. He shoved the paper into his backpack, not wanting anyone to see. As the other students filed out of the room, Darius remained seated, his hands gripping the edges of his desk. He felt frozen, unable to move, unable to think clearly. Ethan noticed that Darius hadn't moved and nudged him. You good? Darius forced himself to nod. Yeah, I'm fine, he muttered, though his voice sounded hollow. I'll catch up with you later. Ethan gave him a curious look but didn't push. All right, see you at lunch. As soon as the classroom emptied, Darius stood up, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and walked out into the hallway. He could feel the weight of the paper pressing against his back like it was burning a hole through his bag. He needed to get out of the building, away from the noise, away from everything. Instead of going to lunch, he headed outside to the school courtyard, where a few kids were scattered across benches and picnic tables, eating and chatting. Darius found an empty corner by a tree and sat down, his back resting against the rough bark. He pulled out the essay again and stared at the comment, his mind racing with anger, confusion, and shame. He couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation. Mr. Dawson hadn't just criticized his work, he had attacked something deeper, something personal. With your background. The words echoed in his head, each time slicing a little deeper. It wasn't just about the essay. It was about who Darius was, about the color of his skin, about his family, about everything. For a long time, Darius sat there, staring at the paper, the weight of the insult crushing him. He didn't want to tell anyone. He didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but he couldn't keep it to himself either. The longer he sat there, the more the anger bubbled up inside him. When he got home that afternoon, he couldn't hide his mood from Lisa. She immediately noticed that something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked as he came in, dropping his bag by the door with more force than usual. Darius hesitated. He didn't want to talk about it, but he also couldn't hold it in anymore. "It's nothing," he muttered, heading for the stairs. But Lisa wasn't having it. She gently caught his arm, turning him around to face her. "Darius, talk to me. What's going on?" For a moment, Darius considered brushing her off, but then the frustration and hurt exploded out of him. "I got my history essay back," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Mr. Dawson gave me a C+, and he wrote this." He pulled the crumpled essay from his backpack and handed it to her, pointing to the comment at the bottom. Lisa's brow furrowed as she read the note. Her eyes widened in shock, and then her face darkened with anger. "With your background," she repeated, her voice low and incredulous. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I don't know," Darius said, though they both knew what it meant. He could see the anger in his mother's eyes, and it mirrored the anger boiling inside him. Lisa straightened up, her voice steady but fierce. "We're going to talk to your father about this when he gets home. This isn't something we're going to let slide." Darius nodded, though he wasn't sure how he felt about it. Part of him wanted to fight back, but another part of him was terrified of what would happen if they made a big deal out of it. He didn't want to be seen as a troublemaker, especially not over something like this. But it wasn't just a small thing, and deep down, Darius knew that. It wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger. That evening, Greg Morgan came home from work later than usual. As a civil rights attorney, his days were often long and grueling, filled with meetings, court appearances, and paperwork. But no matter how tired he was, Greg always made time for his family. As soon as he walked through the door, Lisa approached him with the essay in hand. "We need to talk," she said, her voice tight with anger. Greg looked at her, then at Darius, who was sitting at the kitchen table, his head down. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with concern. Lisa handed him the paper, pointing to the comment at the bottom. "This is what Mr. Dawson wrote on Darius's history essay." Greg's eyes scanned the page, and when he reached the comment, his jaw tightened. He stared at the words for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before carefully folding the paper and setting it on the table. "I'm going to the school tomorrow," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with an intensity that Darius had rarely seen in his father. Greg had always been calm, even in the face of injustice. But there was something different in his eyes now, something fiercer. "Dad, you don't have to," Darius began, but Greg held up a hand. "This isn't just about you, Darius," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "This is about something bigger. If we don't call this out, it's going to keep happening. Not just to you, but to other kids too." Darius swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his father's words. He knew Greg was right, but he also couldn't help feeling a pit of dread in his stomach. He didn't want to be the center of attention. He didn't want to be the kid who caused a scene. But as he sat there, watching his father's determined expression, he realized that this was bigger than his own fears. This was about doing what was right, no matter how uncomfortable it made him. The next day, Greg was at Hamilton Middle School first thing in the morning. He had called ahead and arranged a meeting with Principal Andrews and Mr. Dawson. Darius had wanted to stay out of it, but Greg insisted he be there. The three of them sat in the small, dimly lit office. Principal Andrews, a balding man with a nervous smile, greeted them with a handshake, but Greg's demeanor remained tense. Mr. Dawson sat stiffly in his chair, his face expressionless. "Mr. Morgan," Principal Andrews began, folding his hands on his desk, "I understand you're upset, but I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Greg interrupted, his voice calm but deadly serious. He pulled Darius's essay from his briefcase and placed it on the desk. "This comment," he pointed to the note at the bottom, "is unacceptable." Mr. Dawson cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable for the first time. I didn't mean for it to come across that way," he said, his voice defensive. "I was simply referring to Darius's academic background, his performance in previous assignments." "With all due respect, Mr. Dawson," Greg said, his voice still calm but simmering with anger, "you didn't just criticize his performance, you singled out his background, and we both know what you meant by that." Principal Andrews shifted nervously in his seat, glancing between Greg and Mr. Dawson. "Mr. Morgan, I assure you, we take these matters very seriously. We can discuss how to—" Greg leaned forward, his eyes locked on the principal. "This isn't just about a discussion. This is about accountability. Comments like this aren't just inappropriate, they're damaging. They send a message that some students don't belong. And I won't allow that message to be sent to my son or any other child in this school." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Principal Andrews fumbled for words, but Greg stood up, gathering his things. "I'll be in touch," he said coldly, before leading Darius out of the office. As they left the school, Darius felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief that his father had stood up for him, but anxiety about what was going to happen next. He knew that confronting Mr. Dawson was just the beginning. Returning to school the next day was harder than Darius expected. The tension from the meeting his father had with Principal Andrews and Mr. Dawson hadn't disappeared. It seemed to have spread, silently but palpably, through the halls of Hamilton Middle School. Darius could feel it the moment he walked in, an unspoken tension in the air, like everyone knew something had happened but no one wanted to talk about it openly. Ethan met him at their usual spot near the lockers before first period, bouncing a basketball off the floor as he usually did to start the day. "Yo, how'd it go yesterday?" he asked, his eyes scanning Darius's face for a clue to how he was feeling. Darius shrugged, trying to keep his expression neutral. "My dad talked to Mr. Dawson. They're handling it, I guess." "Good," Ethan said, nodding. "They better handle it. Dawson had no right to say that to you." "Yeah," Darius said, his voice quieter. He looked around at the other students hurrying by, a few of them casting sideways glances in his direction. He could already feel the whispers starting, the conversations happening just outside of his hearing. Was it about the meeting? Did people know what Mr. Dawson had written on his paper? The thought of being the center of attention for this reason made his stomach turn. As the day went on, it became clear that the story had spread. Some kids seemed to be avoiding Darius altogether, pretending not to notice him in the hallways or at lunch. A few of the students in his history class gave him awkward looks, as if unsure whether to ask him what happened or to ignore it altogether. Then there were the ones like Zach, who made it painfully clear where they stood. Darius was walking to his locker between classes when he heard Zach and his friends snickering from behind. He tried to ignore it, focusing on his combination lock, but then he heard Zach's voice loud enough to make sure Darius heard every word. "So what's the deal with Morgan, huh? Heard his daddy had to come to school and cry to the principal 'cause Mr. Dawson hurt his feelings." Darius's hands tightened on the locker door, but he didn't turn around. He could feel his face heating up, the frustration bubbling inside him. He wasn't someone who normally got into fights, and he didn't want to give Zach the satisfaction of reacting. Zach continued, his voice laced with mockery. Maybe if he spent more time studying instead of complaining, he'd get better grades. But nah, it's easier to blame the teacher when you suck. A few of Zach's friends laughed, the sound sharp and grating in Darius's ears. His heart pounded, and he clenched his fists at his sides, trying to keep himself calm. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, but the words felt caught in his throat. Ethan appeared just then, catching the tail end of Zach's taunt. His face darkened, and without hesitation he stepped in front of Darius, glaring at Zach. "Back off, man," Ethan snapped. "You got no idea what you're talking about." Zach smirked but didn't push further. "Whatever, man. Just saying what everyone else is thinking." He gave Darius one last look before turning to leave, his friends trailing behind him. Darius's whole body felt tense, like a coiled spring ready to snap. He forced himself to take a deep breath, turning back to his locker as Ethan stood beside him, his arms crossed in frustration. "You okay?" Ethan asked after a moment, his tone softer now. Darius nodded, but the truth was, he wasn't okay. He had expected some pushback, but not like that. He hadn't realized how quickly things would escalate, how fast rumors and whispers would turn into open mockery. The rest of the day felt like a blur. Darius kept his head down, avoiding eye contact, moving from class to class without really paying attention to anything the teachers were saying. Every time he walked through the halls, he could feel eyes on him, could sense the unspoken conversations happening just out of earshot. When Darius got home that afternoon, the house felt unusually quiet. His mom was in the kitchen, but there was no sound of music playing, no hum of conversation. His dad's car was already in the driveway, which meant Greg was home early, a rare occurrence. Normally, Greg didn't get home until after dinner, so seeing his car there sent a small jolt of unease through Darius. He walked into the kitchen to find his parents sitting at the table, talking in low voices. They stopped when they saw him enter, and Lisa gave him a strained smile. "Hey, sweetie, how was school today?" she asked, though her voice carried a note of tension, as if she already knew the answer. Darius shrugged, dropping his backpack onto the floor. It was fine. Greg exchanged a look with Lisa before turning to Darius. "We had a meeting with Principal Andrews again today. They're going to conduct a formal review of Mr. Dawson." Darius wasn't surprised, but the news didn't bring him any relief either. Instead, it felt like the situation was getting more and more out of control. "What does that mean exactly?" Greg leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "It means they're going to look into whether Mr. Dawson's behavior crosses a line. It's not just about what he wrote on your essay. It's about the environment he's creating in the classroom. If other students feel uncomfortable or discriminated against, that's something the school has to address." Darius nodded but stayed silent. He didn't want to talk about it anymore. The weight of the day was pressing down on him, and all he wanted was to escape, to his room, put on some music, and block out the world. "I don't want to keep pushing this if it's making things harder for you," Greg said, his voice gentler now. "But you need to know that we're not just doing this for you. We're doing this because it's the right thing to do." Darius looked up at his father, the frustration and confusion building inside him. "I know, Dad, I get it. But everything feels messed up now. People at school are acting like I'm causing problems. I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to write my essay and get my grade." Greg's expression softened, and he reached out to place a hand on Darius's shoulder. "I know this is hard, son, but sometimes doing the right thing means standing up, even when it feels like the whole world is against you. And you're not causing problems. Mr. Dawson is the one who crossed a line, not you." Darius nodded, but the knot in his chest didn't loosen. He understood what his father was saying, but it didn't make the day-to-day reality of school any easier to bear. Lisa, who had been quietly listening, stood up and walked over to hug Darius. "We're proud of you no matter what," she said softly, holding him close. "And we'll get through this, together." Darius let out a breath, resting his head against his mom's shoulder for a moment. But even as she hugged him, the weight of everything still pressed down on him. He knew his parents were right, but he couldn't help feeling like things were spiraling out of control, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. The next morning, Darius tried to shake off the heaviness that had settled over him, but it clung to him like a shadow. He walked into school with Ethan, who had been unusually quiet on the way there. Darius could sense that his friend wanted to say something, but Ethan seemed to be holding back. They stopped by their lockers, the usual morning rush of students bustling around them. Ethan finally spoke, keeping his voice low. "Darius, man, I think you need to watch out for Zach and his crew." Darius frowned, pulling out his books for the first period. "What do you mean?" "I overheard them talking in the locker room after practice yesterday," Ethan said, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "They're pissed about the meeting your dad had with Dawson. They think you're just trying to get Dawson fired or something. Zach's saying some messed up stuff like you're using your race card to make this into a bigger deal than it is." Darius felt a sharp pang of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Of course they'd say that," he muttered, slamming his locker shut. "They don't get it." Ethan nodded, his expression serious. "I know. And that's why I'm telling you. I don't trust them, Darius. Zach's always looking for a fight, and if they keep pushing, something's going to happen." Darius knew Ethan was right. Zach had always been the type to stir up trouble, and now, with the added tension from the Dawson situation, it was only a matter of time before things escalated. "I'll keep my distance," Darius said, though the thought of avoiding Zach and his friends only made him feel more isolated. "But I'm not going to let them intimidate me." Ethan nodded, his hand clapping Darius's shoulder in support. "I've got your back, man. Just don't do anything stupid, all right?" "Yeah," Darius said, his voice low. "I won't." But deep down, he wasn't sure how long he could keep walking away from the fight. By the time the final bell rang, Darius felt emotionally and physically drained. The day had been a haze of strained conversations, awkward glances, and whispers behind his back. Every time he passed Zach and his crew in the hallway, he could feel their eyes on him, their laughter sharp and cutting, though they never said anything directly to his face. But as Darius walked toward the front entrance to leave for the day, he spotted Zach leaning against the wall, arms crossed, his friends gathered around him. This time there was no avoiding them. Darius had to pass them to get outside, and he braced himself for whatever was about to happen. "Hey, Morgan," Zach called out as Darius walked by, his tone dripping with mock friendliness. "How's your daddy doing? Still fighting your battles for you?" Darius's jaw tightened, but he kept walking, refusing to give Zach the satisfaction of a reaction. "Come on, man," Zach continued, pushing himself off the wall and stepping into Darius's path. "Don't be like that. We're just trying to figure out why you're making such a big deal out of this. Mr. Dawson didn't mean anything by that comment, but I guess it's easier to play the victim, right?" Darius stopped in his tracks, his pulse quickening. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. He wanted to say something, anything to shut Zach up, but his mind was racing too fast to form the right words. Zach smirked, stepping closer. "What's the matter? Can't handle the truth?" Something inside Darius snapped. The constant pressure, the whispers, the comments, it was too much. Without thinking, he turned to face Zach, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You don't know anything about me," Darius said, his voice low but filled with barely contained rage. "You don't know what it's like." "Oh, I know exactly what it's like," Zach said, his tone mocking. "You've got everything handed to you on a silver platter, And when things don't go your way, you cry racism. It's pathetic. Darius's heart pounded in his ears, the world narrowing to just him and Zach. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through him, his fists aching to strike out, to shut Zach up once and for all. But just as he was about to step forward, Ethan appeared at his side, grabbing his arm. "Darius, don't," Ethan said, his voice urgent. "He's not worth it." Darius looked at Ethan, his friend's eyes filled with concern, and slowly he forced himself to take a step back. The anger was still there, burning inside him, but he knew that hitting Zach wouldn't solve anything. It would only make things worse. Zach smirked, clearly satisfied that he had gotten under Darius's skin. "That's what I thought," he said, turning to walk away with his friends. Ethan kept his hand on Darius's arm, waiting until Zach and his crew were out of sight before letting go. "You all right?" he asked, his voice tense. Darius nodded, though his hands were still trembling with the effort of holding back. "Yeah, I'm good." But as they walked home, Darius couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him. He had always been the quiet kid, the one who kept his head down and avoided trouble. But now, he felt like he was standing on the edge of something dangerous, like the line between right and wrong was becoming harder to see. And he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep himself from crossing it. The weekend provided Darius with a small reprieve, but even then, the weight of everything hung heavy over him. He spent most of Saturday lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside him. The anger, the hurt, the frustration, it all felt too big, too complex to deal with. Ethan texted him a few times, checking in, but Darius didn't feel like talking. He could still hear Zach's taunting voice in his head, mocking him, belittling the struggles he faced. And no matter how many times Darius told himself that Zach's words didn't matter, that they were just the opinions of an ignorant bully, they still gnawed at him, cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. By Sunday evening, Darius knew he couldn't avoid his parents any longer. Lisa had been hovering around him all weekend, dropping gentle hints that she and Greg wanted to talk. Darius had managed to evade the conversation, claiming that he was tired or not feeling well, but he knew they wouldn't let him slip by for much longer. After dinner, Greg called Darius into the living room. His father sat on the couch, the TV turned off, and the usual lightheartedness in his eyes was replaced with concern. Lisa sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Darius, we need to talk," Greg began, his voice calm but firm. Darius shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew where this was going. "We've noticed that you've been distant lately," Lisa said, her voice soft. "We know this situation with Mr. Dawson has been weighing on you." Darius nodded but didn't say anything. He didn't know how to put into words the confusion and frustration swirling inside him. He wanted to tell them about Zach, about the things being said behind his back, but something held him back. Maybe it was the fear of making things worse. Maybe it was the thought that his parents already had enough on their plates. "I know it's been tough," Greg continued, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "But we're proud of you for standing up for yourself, Darius. This fight, it's not easy, but it's important. You're making a difference, not just for yourself, but for others." Darius looked down at his hands, clenching and unclenching his fists. "I don't feel like I'm making a difference," he muttered. "I feel like everything's just getting worse." His parents exchanged a glance, and Lisa scooted closer to him on the couch. "We know it's hard to see right now, but change takes time. People like Zach, they want to tear you down because they're afraid of that change." Greg nodded. "Zach's a bully, and bullies thrive on fear. But you don't have to face this alone. We're here, and so is Ethan. You've got people in your corner." Darius felt a lump form in his throat, but he swallowed it down. He appreciated their support, but it didn't change the fact that every day at school felt like a battle. and sometimes it felt like he was losing. Monday morning came far too quickly, and the thought of facing another week at school made Darius feel physically sick. But there was no avoiding it, and as he walked through the front doors of Hamilton Middle School, he stole himself for whatever was coming next. In the days following the confrontation with Zach, the tension had only escalated. Rumors swirled through the school like wildfire. Whispers that Darius's dad was going to sue Mr. Dawson, that Darius was trying to get teachers fired. Each rumor was more ridiculous than the last, but they all added to the pressure that had been building since the day Darius got his essay back. Ethan did his best to deflect the rumors, shutting down anyone who dared to talk trash about Darius in front of him. But even Ethan couldn't be everywhere at once. By lunchtime, Darius felt like he was walking through a minefield, every glance, every murmur setting him further on edge. "I swear these kids have no idea what they're talking about," Ethan muttered as they sat down at their usual lunch table. "Zach's spreading all kinds of garbage. I heard him saying something about your dad trying to get Dawson fired." Darius sighed, pushing his tray away. His appetite was gone. "I just don't get why people care so much," he said. "It's like they think I'm the bad guy." "They're scared," Ethan replied, shrugging. "Change freaks people out. They'd rather keep things the way they are than admit something's wrong." Darius knew Ethan was right, but it didn't make the situation any easier to deal with. As they sat in the noisy cafeteria, the weight of it all pressed down on him, suffocating at its intensity. But things were about to get even worse. The final bell rang, and Darius made his way to his locker, eager to get out of the building and away from the oppressive atmosphere of the school. But when he opened his locker, something inside it stopped him from cold. A piece of paper was taped to the inside of the door. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary note, but when Darius unfolded it, his stomach dropped. "Go back to where you came from." The words were written in thick black marker, and they were accompanied by a crude drawing of a noose. Darius's hands trembled as he stared at the note, his mind racing. He looked around, but the hallway was nearly empty. Whoever had left the note was long gone. Ethan appeared at Darius's side, frowning when he saw the look on his friend's face. "What's wrong?" Wordlessly, Darius handed him the note. Ethan's eyes darkened as he read it, his jaw clenching. "What the hell? Who did this?" Darius shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know." Ethan crumpled the note in his hand, his expression tight with anger. "This is too far. You need to report this, Darius. This isn't just bullying. This is hate." Darius wanted to agree, but something inside him froze. Reporting it meant drawing even more attention to himself. It meant escalating things even further, making himself an even bigger target. He was already on the edge of breaking up, and the thought of taking on more, of dealing with whatever fallout came from reporting the note, felt like too much. "I'll think about it," Darius said, his voice flat. Ethan frowned. "Darius, you can't just let this slide. Whoever did this isn't going to stop unless someone calls them out." "I know," Darius muttered, shoving his books into his backpack, "but I need time to figure this out." Ethan didn't push any further, but Darius could see the concern etched into his friend's face. He appreciated it, but at that moment, he didn't want anyone's pity. He just wanted to disappear. That night, Darius lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, the note replaying in his mind over and over again. He had shoved it into his backpack, planning to throw it away, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. The words haunted him, a cruel reminder that no matter how much progress he thought he was making, there were still people who saw him as nothing more than an outsider, someone who didn't belong. Go back to where you came from. The message was as old as time, and yet it still cut just as deeply. Darius had grown up hearing about racism, about the struggles his father had faced as a black man in America, But this was the first time he had experienced something like this firsthand. Something so raw, so filled with hate. His mind was racing, unable to settle. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of the noose flashed in his mind, followed by Zach's smirking face. He didn't know for sure if Zach was behind the note, but he wouldn't be surprised. Darius rolled over in bed, trying to quiet the storm inside him, but anger, frustration, the fear, it all welled up, threatening to spill over. Finally, he grabbed his phone and sent a text to Ethan. "Darius, I'm not going to school tomorrow." A few seconds later, Ethan responded. "Ethan, what do you mean? You sick?" Darius stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Part of him wanted to tell Ethan everything to unload the weight of what he was feeling. But another part of him, the part that had always been quiet, always kept things to himself, couldn't bring himself to open up. "Darius, I just need a break. I'll be back the next day." Ethan's response was quick. "Ethan, you sure? You know you can talk to me, right?" Darius felt a pang of guilt. He knew Ethan was trying to help, but the thought of talking, of opening up, felt too overwhelming. "Darius, yeah, I'm sure. Thanks, though." Ethan didn't push, and after a few more minutes of staring at his phone, Darius set it down and rolled onto his back again. The weight of the note, the school, the confrontation with Zach, it all pressed down on him, suffocating in its intensity. He didn't know how much longer he could keep it together. Tuesday morning came and Darius stayed in bed, feigning illness when Lisa came to check on him. She seemed concerned but didn't push him to go to school, and for that Darius was grateful. He spent the day in a haze, moving from his bed to the couch and back again, but no matter where he went, the heaviness in his chest remained. He couldn't escape it. Every thought, every movement felt like a reminder of the hate that had been directed at him, of the world that was starting to close in around him. By mid-afternoon, Darius knew he couldn't keep avoiding everything. He couldn't hide in his room forever. He needed to do something, to take control of the situation before it consumed him. But what could he do? Confronting Zach would only lead to more trouble. Reporting the note would escalate things even further, possibly putting a target on his back that he wasn't ready to deal with. He felt trapped, like every option was a dead end. Later that evening, when Greg got home, Darius found himself in the kitchen with his dad, watching as Greg sorted through some papers from work. Darius hadn't planned on saying anything, but the words slipped out before he could stop them. "Dad, can I talk to you?" Greg looked up, immediately sensing the seriousness in Darius's tone. He set the papers aside and turned to face his son fully. "Of course. What's going on?" Darius hesitated, the weight of the note still pressing on him, but he knew he couldn't keep it to himself any longer. Slowly, he pulled the crumpled paper from his pocket and handed it to his dad. Greg's face darkened as he read the note, his expression hardening with every word. By the time he finished, his jaw was tight with anger. "Who did this?" Greg asked, his voice low but laced with fury. "I don't know," Darius admitted, "but I think it might be Zach or his friends." Greg exhaled slowly, trying to keep his voice calm. "Darius, this is serious. This isn't something we can ignore. We need to report this." "I know," Darius said, though the thought of reporting the note still filled him with dread. "But if we do, won't it just make things worse?" Greg's expression softened, and he placed a hand on Darius's shoulder. "I know it feels like that right now, but silence won't stop this. We have to take a stand no matter how hard it is. You don't deserve to go through this, and neither does anyone else." Darius nodded, though the knot in his chest remained. He knew his dad was right, but the fear of what might come next still loomed large in his mind. The morning after showing the note to his father, Darius woke up with a hollow feeling in his chest. It had taken all of his energy just to get out of bed, knowing what was coming. He hadn't wanted to involve the school any further, but after seeing the fury in his dad's eyes the night before, he knew that things had already passed the point of no return. Lisa had driven him to school that day rather than letting him walk. As they pulled up to the front of Hamilton Middle, Darius noticed his dad's car parked near the entrance. Greg had already called the school early that morning to set up a meeting with Principal Andrews and Ms. Baxter, the school's counselor. Darius would have to tell them about the note. As much as Darius dreaded the idea, he also knew his parents were right. He couldn't let this slide. Whoever had left that note in his locker wasn't just playing around anymore. This wasn't like the whispers or the teasing. This was hate, pure and simple. And Darius couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that if he didn't speak up now, it would only get worse. Inside the principal's office, the mood was tense. Greg sat beside Darius, his posture stiff, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Across from them, Principal Andrews and Ms. Baxter exchanged uneasy glances, as if they were trying to process the gravity of what they had been told. So, let me get this straight. Principal Andrews began slowly, leaning forward on his desk. This note was left in your locker, and you suspect that it might have been one of your classmates. Darius nodded. I don't know for sure who did it, but there's this kid, Zach. He's been making comments about me ever since the thing with Mr. Dawson started. I think it could have been him or one of his friends. Greg's expression hardened. This is more than just bullying. This is a direct threat. I want to know what steps the school is planning to take. Ms. Baxter spoke next, her voice gentle but serious. Darius, I know this has been a difficult time for you. First with Mr. Dawson's comments, and now this. I can't imagine how overwhelming this must feel. She paused, as if weighing her next words carefully. We'll investigate this thoroughly. We'll check the security footage near the lockers and question the students who may have been involved. Darius could sense his dad's frustration building, but Greg kept his voice steady. And in the meantime, what's going to be done to make sure my son feels safe at this school? Principal Andrews' jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. We'll increase monitoring in the hallways, particularly around Darius's locker. We'll also notify the faculty to keep an eye out for any suspicious behavior, but rest assured we'll take this seriously. Darius sat quietly, his hands clenched in his lap. He appreciated that his dad was fighting for him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to escalate things even further. The thought of going back to class after this meeting, with everyone knowing that he had reported the note, made his stomach churn. After the meeting, Darius walked back to class, his feet heavy, his mind spinning. He knew Ethan would be there, waiting to hear what happened, but even knowing his friend had his back didn't stop the knot of dread from tightening in his chest. Over the next few days, the school buzzed with rumors. It didn't take long for word to spread that Darius had reported the note to the principal. By the time he returned to his usual spot in the cafeteria, the whispers had already begun. Did you hear? Morgan's making a big deal about some note. I heard they're saying it was a hate crime or something. Bet he's just trying to get that teacher fired. Darius sat down across from Ethan, keeping his head down as the voices around him grew louder. He could feel the weight of their stares, the way people looked at him like he was something to be avoided. Ethan leaned forward, his voice low. You okay? Darius nodded, though the truth was, he wasn't okay. He hadn't been okay for a while. The note had been bad enough, but now the rumors have taken on a life of their own. Everywhere he went, he could feel eyes on him, people watching him like he was some kind of spectacle. Man, I hate this, Darius muttered, pushing his tray away. Why can't people just mind their own business? They're just scared, Ethan said, his voice filled with frustration. They don't know what it's like. They're all acting like it's no big deal because they've never had to deal with something like this. Darius shook his head. I'm tired of being the one they're all talking about. It's like No matter what I do, it's never enough. I stand up for myself, and I'm the bad guy. I stay quiet, and they walk all over me." Ethan sighed, his hand tapping against the table. "I know, man, I got it. But you can't let them win. You've got to keep your head up." "I don't even know if I want to be here anymore," Darius admitted, his voice quiet. "It's like, no matter where I go, I don't belong." Ethan frowned, his eyes dark with concern. "You belong here, Darius. Don't let them make you feel like you don't." Darius appreciated Ethan's words, but deep down, the feeling of isolation had already settled in. He had always known he was different, one of the only black kids in a mostly white school, but now that difference felt like a target on his back. Everywhere he went, he was reminded of it, in the way people looked at him, in the way they whispered behind his back. By the time lunch was over, Darius felt like he was drowning in the weight of it all. The fear, the frustration, the anger, it was all building inside him, and he didn't know how much longer he could keep it from exploding. The breaking point came sooner than Darius expected. It was Friday afternoon, and the final bell had just rung. Darius was at his locker, gathering his things to head home, when he heard Zach's voice behind him. "Yo, Morgan," Zach called out, his tone dripping with mockery. "You still crying to the principal? Still playing the victim?" Darius clenched his jaw, trying to ignore him. He shoved his books into his backpack, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and fear. But Zach didn't stop. He walked closer, his voice louder now, drawing the attention of a few other students lingering in the hallway. "What's it like, man? Playing the race card every time something doesn't go your way?" Darius slammed his locker shut, his hands shaking. He turned to face Zach, his voice low and tight. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think I do," Zach sneered, stepping closer. "You think you're special because of your skin color? Think you can just pull that card whenever you want to get out of trouble?" Something inside Darius snapped. The anger that had been building for weeks finally bubbled over, and before he knew what he was doing, he shoved Zach hard in the chest. Zach stumbled back, his eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, the hallway was silent. Everyone was watching in shock. But then Zach's smirk returned, and he stepped forward, shoving Darius back. "What are you going to do, Morgan?" Zach taunted, his voice sharp. "You think you can take me?" Before Darius could respond, Ethan appeared at his side, his hand on Darius's shoulder. "Darius, don't," he said urgently. "He's not worth it." Darius's hands were shaking, his vision blurry with rage. He wanted to hit Zach, to make him feel just a fraction of the pain he had been carrying. But Ethan's voice broke through the fog, and slowly Darius forced himself to back down. Zach laughed, shaking his head. "That's what I thought," he muttered, turning to walk away. "All talk, no fight." Darius watched as Zach disappeared down the hallway, his heart still pounding in his chest. He could feel Ethan's grip on his shoulder, grounding him, keeping him from doing something he would regret. "Come on," Ethan said quietly. "Let's get out of here." As they walked out of the school, Darius felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. He had come so close to losing control, to letting Zach get the best of him. But even though he had walked away, the anger still simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the next spark to ignite it. That evening, Darius couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that had been building inside him for weeks. After the confrontation with Zach, he had tried to distract himself by watching TV, playing video games, anything to keep his mind off the storm brewing inside him. But nothing worked. The anger, the fear, the isolation, it was all too much. He found himself sitting on the floor of his bedroom, staring at the crumpled note still shoved in his backpack. He hadn't told his parents about the confrontation with Zach, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. They had enough to worry about already, and he didn't want to add to the weight they were carrying. But as he sat there, alone in his room, Darius realized that he couldn't keep everything bottled up anymore. The pressure was great. He felt like he was suffocating under the weight of it all. Grabbing his phone, Darius scrolled through his contacts until he found Ethan's name. He hesitated for a moment, his thumb hovering over the screen. He didn't want to burden his friend with his problems, but he also knew that if he didn't talk to someone, he might explode. Finally, he hit call. Ethan picked up after the first ring. "Hey man, you okay?" Darius didn't answer right away. He didn't know how to put into words the storm of emotions swirling inside him, but after a long pause, he finally spoke. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," Darius admitted, his voice cracking. I feel like everything's falling apart." There was silence on the other end for a moment, and when Ethan finally spoke, his voice was soft, filled with concern. "I'm coming over, just hang tight." Ethan showed up at Darius's house within 15 minutes, not even bothering to text or call to let him know he was on his way. He didn't need to. He could hear in Darius's voice that this wasn't something that could wait. When Darius opened the door, Ethan's face was tight with concern. He didn't say much at first, just stepped inside and followed Darius up to his room. The tension in the air was thick, the unspoken weight of Darius's struggles hanging between them like a storm cloud. Once they were upstairs, Darius sat down heavily on the edge of his bed, his hands gripping the bedspread as if he were trying to keep himself anchored. Ethan remained standing for a moment, pacing slightly before he finally spoke. "So, what's going on?" Ethan asked, his voice careful. "You sounded—" "I don't know, man. It sounded bad." Darius let out a long, shaky breath. He had known this conversation was coming, but now that it was here, he didn't know how to start. How could he explain the way everything had spiraled, how the pressure had built and built until it felt like he was being suffocated by it? "I don't know how to handle this," Darius said finally, his voice quiet. "It's like, no matter what I do, it's wrong. I thought reporting that note was the right thing, but now everyone's treating me like I'm the problem. And Zach, he's not going to let up." Ethan frowned, pulling a chair closer to the bed and sitting across from Darius. "Zach's a piece of crap, you know that. He's just doing this because he feels threatened. He's the one with the problem, not you." Darius nodded, but the knot in his chest didn't loosen. "I get that, but it's not just Zach, it's everyone. Even people who used to talk to me act like I've got some kind of disease. They don't say anything to my face, but I can feel it. Every time I walk into a room, it's like they're waiting for me to screw up." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Look, I don't know how to make all that go away, but I do know that you can't let them break you. You've come too far to back down now." Darius's eyes stung with unshed tears, and he quickly wiped them away, trying to keep himself from breaking down in front of his best friend. "I'm just tired of fighting, tired of feeling like nothing I do matters." Ethan's expression softened. "I know, man, I get it, but you're not in this alone. You've got your parents, you've got me. We're not going to let Zach or anyone else take you down." For a moment, Darius didn't say anything. He just stared down at his hands, feeling the weight of Ethan's words settle over him. He knew his friend was right, but that didn't change how overwhelming everything felt. The isolation, the pressure, the anger, it was all still there, simmering just beneath the surface. But hearing Ethan say it out loud, hearing the conviction in his voice, made something inside Darius shift. Maybe he wasn't completely alone in this. Maybe there was still a way out. The days that followed Ethan's visit were quiet. Too quiet. At school, the rumors about Darius had died down, and even Zach seemed to have taken a step back, no longer pushing for a confrontation at every opportunity. But the silence felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. Darius couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing, that Zach and his friends were planning something. In the meantime, Darius tried to keep his head down and focus on school, but the tension never fully left him. Every time he walked through the hallways, he was hyper-aware of the glances, the whispers, the way people seemed to shift when he passed by. The note, the confrontation with Zach, it all lingered in the background, like a shadow following him everywhere he went. Ethan had been right there with him, walking the halls like Darius's own personal bodyguard. It wasn't something they talked about openly, but Darius knew Ethan was watching, ready to step in if anything happened. It was comforting, in a way, but also a constant reminder of how far things had gone. One afternoon, as they were sitting in the cafeteria, Ethan leaned over and spoke in a low voice. "You noticed how quiet it's been?" Darius nodded, glancing around the room. "Yeah, it's weird." "I don't trust it," Ethan muttered. "Zach's not the type to just let things go. He's probably planning something." Darius sighed, pushing his food around on his tray. "I know. I can feel it too, but I don't know what to do about it." Ethan's expression darkened. "We keep our guard up. That's all we can do." Despite Ethan's words, the unease gnawed at Darius. He had been on edge for so long that the quiet felt unnatural, like the eye of a hurricane. He knew something was coming, but he didn't know when or how bad it would be. That night, as he lay in bed, Darius tried to push the thoughts of Zach and his friends out of his mind. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. It happened on a Friday, just as Darius was beginning to let his guard down. The day had started like any other, quiet, uneventful. Darius had even started to believe that maybe things were starting to calm down, that maybe the worst was behind him. But he should have known better. It was after school, and Darius was walking home alone. Ethan had basketball practice, and Darius had planned to head home, finish his homework, and maybe play some video games to relax. The sky was overcast, the kind of gloomy afternoon that made everything feel heavier, slower. As he turned the corner near his street, Darius heard footsteps behind him. He glanced over his shoulder and felt his stomach drop. Zach and two of his friends, Logan and Matt, were walking toward him, their faces hard, their eyes locked on him with menacing intensity. Darius's heart raced, his pulse quickening as he quickened his pace. He could feel the tension building, the inevitable confrontation looming closer with each step. He wasn't far from home, but he knew he wouldn't make it before they caught up to him. "Hey, Morgan," Zach's voice rang out, sharp and taunting. "You in a hurry or something?" Darius didn't respond. He kept walking, hoping against hope that they would leave him alone. But the sound of their footsteps quickened, and soon they were right behind him. In one swift motion, Zach grabbed Darius's backpack and yanked him backward. Darius stumbled, catching himself before he fell, but the shock of the sudden movement sent adrenaline surging through his veins. "What do you want, Zach?" Darius asked, his voice tight, barely masking his fear. Zach stepped closer, his smirk twisted with malice. "I want to know why you think you can go crying to the principal every time something doesn't go your way." Logan and Matt flanked him, their expressions just as hostile. Darius's mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but he knew there was no talking his way out of this. Zach had been waiting for this moment, waiting to corner Darius when he was alone, when no one was around to stop him. "I'm not crying to anyone," Darius said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm just trying to stand up for myself." Zach's eyes narrowed, his smirk fading. "You think you're better than me, don't you? Think you're some kind of hero?" Darius shook his head. "I don't think I'm better than anyone. I just want you to leave me alone." Zach stepped even closer, his face inches from Darius's. "That's not how this works, Morgan. You don't get to just walk away." Before Darius could react, Zach shoved him hard, sending him stumbling backward. His heart pounded in his chest, fear and anger swirling inside him. He wanted to fight back, but he knew that if he did, it would only make things worse, But Zach wasn't done. He lunged forward, grabbing the front of Darius's shirt and shoving him against the fence that lined the sidewalk. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and Darius gasped for breath, his mind racing. Logan and Matt stood by, watching with cold indifference as Zach shoved Darius again, harder this time. "Come on, Morgan," Zach sneered. "Fight back. I know you want to." Darius's fists clenched at his sides, his entire body trembling with the effort of holding back. He wanted to fight. He wanted to hit Zach so hard that he would never think of messing with him again. But something inside him held him back. The words of his father, his mother, Ethan, they all echoed in his mind. "Don't let them drag you down. You don't have to fight. You're better than this." But the anger, the rage, was too much. His vision blurred, his pulse roaring in his ears. He couldn't hold it back anymore. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Darius shoved Zach away from him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Zach stumbled back, surprised for a moment, but then his face twisted in fury. He lunged at Darius, and before he knew what was happening, they were on the ground, fists flying, legs tangled as they wrestled on the pavement. Logan and Matt cheered Zach on, but their voices were distant, drowned out by the blood pounding in Darius's ears. He could barely think, barely see. All he knew was that he couldn't stop, couldn't let Zach win. But then suddenly, it was over. Darius felt strong arms pull him off of Zach, and he struggled for a moment, still caught in the haze of the fight, until he realized who it was. Ethan. "Darius, stop!" Ethan's voice cut through the fog, and Darius blinked, the world coming back into focus. He looked down and saw Zach lying on the ground, his lip bleeding, his face twisted in pain and shock. Darius's chest heaved, his fist still clenched, but the fight was over. Ethan held him back, keeping him from going after Zach again. For a moment the street was silent, the only sound of the ragged breathing of the boys standing there. Then, without another word, Zach scrambled to his feet, wiping the blood from his lip with the back of his hand. "This isn't over," Zach spat, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You're gonna pay for this, Morgan." With that, Zach turned and walked away, Logan and Matt trailing after him. Darius stood frozen, his mind reeling from what had just happened. His fists were still trembling, his body still buzzing with adrenaline. He couldn't believe what he had just done. Ethan was still beside him, his hand on Darius's shoulder. "You okay?" Darius didn't answer right away. He couldn't find the words. All he could do was nod, though he didn't feel okay. He didn't feel anything. The fight changed everything. By Monday morning, the entire school knew what had happened. Darius's fight with Zach had spread like wildfire. And now, instead of whispers about the note or rumors about his father's meeting with Principal Andrews, the school was buzzing with talk of the brawl. Ethan tried to keep Darius calm, but the tension was impossible to ignore. Everywhere they went, kids were either staring at Darius or avoiding him altogether. Even the teachers seemed to treat him differently, though no one said anything directly to his face. But the worst part was the meeting with Principal Andrews. Darius and Ethan had been called to the principal's office first thing in the morning. When they walked in, they found Principal Andrews waiting for them, his expression stern. Zach was already there, sitting in one of the chairs, his lips still swollen from the fight. "Sit down," Principal Andrews said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Darius sat down, his heart pounding. He had known this was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. Principal Andrews glanced between Darius and Zach, his eyes narrowing. "I've heard multiple accounts of what happened on Friday. From what I gather, this was not an isolated incident. This has been building for a while." Neither Darius nor Zach said anything. They both knew better than to speak up without being asked to. "Darius," Principal Andrews continued, turning his attention to him, "I'm disappointed. I expected more from you. You've been through a lot lately, I understand that, but physical violence is never the answer." Darius nodded, his throat tight. He wanted to explain, to tell Principal Andrews everything that had led up to the fight, but he didn't know how. It all felt too tangled, too complicated to put into words. "As for you, Zach," Principal Andrews said, his tone growing colder, "this behavior is unacceptable. This school does not tolerate bullying or harassment in any form." Zach scowled but didn't say anything. It was clear that he wasn't going to take responsibility for anything. Principal Andrews let out a long breath before speaking again. "Both of you are suspended for a week. When you return, I expect this behavior to stop. Is that understood?" Darius's heart sank. A suspension. He had known there would be consequences, but hearing it out loud made it all too real. "Yes, sir," Darius muttered. Zach just shrugged. "Whatever." Principal Andrews frowned but didn't push further. "You're both dismissed." Darius stood and walked out of the office, Ethan following close behind. As they made their way down the hallway, the weight of the suspension settled over Darius like a lead blanket. A week out of school meant missing assignments, falling behind, and even more attention when he came back. But worse than that was the knowledge that despite everything, Zach still wasn't going to let this go. The week of suspension dragged by slower than Darius could have imagined. He had thought that being out of school would give him some time to breathe, but instead it felt like the weight of the situation was pressing down harder than ever. Every day he sat in his room, replaying the fight with Zach in his mind, the way his fists had clenched, the heat of anger blinding him as he'd finally lashed out. His parents weren't angry with him, at least not outwardly. But Darius could feel the disappointment in their voices, especially Greg, who had always stressed the importance of nonviolence. They didn't yell or lecture him. Instead, they gave him space, as if they knew he needed to figure this out on his own. The hardest part was explaining the suspension to Lisa. The look in her eyes when she heard the news had been worse than any punishment. She hadn't expected it from him, and seeing the hurt in her expression had made Darius's stomach twist in knots. "Fighting won't solve anything, Darius," she had said gently, sitting on the edge of his bed. "I know it's hard, but giving in to anger only makes things worse." Darius nodded, but the words didn't settle the turmoil inside him. He knew his parents were right. He knew that fighting wasn't the answer. But in the heat of the moment, when Zach had been right in his face, pushing every button he could, Darius hadn't been able to control it. Now, with a week away from school and plenty of time to reflect, the guilt weighed heavily on him. The suspension felt like an eternity, and all the while he couldn't stop thinking about what was going to happen when he finally returned. How would people look at him? Would Zach be waiting for him again, ready to start more trouble? And what about the other students? Would they still whisper about him, judge him for standing up? The fear gnawed at him constantly. The Friday before Darius's suspension ended, Ethan showed up at his house after school. Darius was sitting in his room, staring blankly at the wall, when he heard a knock on his door. He hadn't expected anyone to come by, so when he opened the door and saw Ethan standing there with a pizza box in hand, he was surprised. "Thought you might need a break," Ethan said with a small grin. "Figured we could hang out, maybe play some video games." Darius couldn't help but smile, a wave of relief washing over him. He hadn't realized just how much he'd been missing normalcy, something that didn't revolve around school drama or the fight with Zach. They sat down in the living room, the TV on, but mostly just background noise as they ate and talked. For a while, they didn't discuss school or the fight at all. Instead, they talked about basketball, the NBA playoffs, and anything else that came to mind. It was easy, comfortable, like things used to be before everything had gone sideways. Eventually, though, the conversation turned back to reality. "So, you ready to go back on Monday?" Ethan asked, glancing at Darius with a mix of concern and curiosity. Darius shrugged, picking at the crust of his pizza. I don't know. I guess I have to be, right? Ethan sighed, setting down his plate. Look, man, I know this whole thing sucks, and I know Zach's probably going to be waiting for you to mess up again, but you can't let him get to you. You're better than him. Darius nodded, but the knot of anxiety in his chest hadn't gone away. I don't know how to face everyone. It feels like I've been in a fight since the day this all started. Even when I'm not fighting Zach, I'm fighting the rumors, the whispers. I'm tired of it. Ethan leaned back on the couch, crossing his arms. Yeah, I get that. But you've got people on your side, too. You're not alone in this, Darius. Darius gave a small smile. Thanks, man. I don't know what I'd do without you. Ethan shrugged, grinning. Hey, someone's got to keep you out of trouble. They both laughed, and for the first time in a while, Darius felt a little lighter. Having Ethan in his corner meant more than he could put into words. No matter what happened at school, at least he had his best friend by his side. When Monday morning arrived, Darius felt the familiar weight of anxiety settle over him. He had barely slept the night before, his mind racing with thoughts of what the day would bring. He had no idea how people were going to react, whether they would still treat him like a pariah, or if things would somehow return to normal. As he walked through the front doors of Hamilton Middle School, it felt like everyone was watching him. The hallways buzzed with chatter, but Darius could feel the shift in attention as he made his way toward his locker. He tried to keep his head down to focus on just getting through the day, but it was impossible to ignore the stares. Ethan was already at their usual spot near the lockers, waiting for him. You good? He asked as Darius approached, giving him a reassuring nod. Yeah, I guess, Darius replied, though his stomach was twisting with nerves. Just got to get through today. The first few classes went by in a blur, the tension still hanging in the air. Darius kept his head down, focused on his work, but he could feel the weight of the students' gazes on him. He didn't say much, trying to blend into the background as much as possible. At lunch, Darius and Ethan sat at their usual table, but things felt different. Other students kept their distance, as if unsure whether to approach or not. Darius caught a few people looking at him, but no one said anything. The silence was worse than the whispers. Then, just as he thought the day might pass without incident, Zach walked into the cafeteria. Darius tensed immediately, his entire body on high alert. He kept his eyes down, hoping Zach would just walk by. But out of the corner of his eye, he saw Zach stop, his gaze lingering on him. For a moment, the cafeteria seemed to go quiet. Darius's heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow. He was ready for Zach to say something, to throw out another taunt or provoke him again. But instead, Zach just stared for a long moment, then turned and walked to the other side of the cafeteria without a word. Darius exhaled slowly, relief flooding his system. He had been bracing for another confrontation, but it hadn't come. Ethan leaned over, his brow furrowed. That was weird. You think he's done with this? Darius shrugged. I don't know. Maybe he's just biding his time. But even as he said it, a part of him hoped that maybe, just maybe, Zach had finally decided to let things go. Though the fight with Zach had left a scar on Darius's reputation, as the days passed, things slowly began to return to some semblance of normalcy. The whispers and stares didn't disappear completely, but they lessened. Most of the students seemed content to move on, focusing on their own lives rather than Darius's drama. But despite the outward calm, Darius couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't fully resolved. The fight had been a turning point, but it hadn't ended the tension. Zach hadn't spoken to him since that day in the cafeteria, but Darius still saw him around school, always watching, always lurking on the edge of his vision. Ethan, ever the optimist, believed that Zach had finally backed off. Maybe he realized it wasn't worth it, he suggested one afternoon as they walked home from school. Maybe, Darius agreed, though he wasn't so sure. Zach didn't seem like the type to just let things go, especially not after the fight. He couldn't shake the feeling that Zach was just waiting for another opportunity to strike. As the weeks went on, Darius tried to focus on his schoolwork and basketball. Basketball, in particular, became his escape. The rhythm of the game, the sound of the ball bouncing on the court, gave him something to focus on, something to keep him grounded. But even as he threw himself into practice, the feeling of unease never fully left him. He knew Zach hadn't given up. He could feel it. Game. The basketball game was supposed to be a chance for Darius to escape the tension. It was the first big game of the season, and Darius had been looking forward to it for weeks. For once, he wasn't thinking about school drama or Zach. He was focused on the game, on winning. The stands were packed, the energy in the gym electric. Darius felt the familiar rush of adrenaline as he warmed up, shooting three-pointers with ease. Ethan was at his side, as always, hyping him up for the game. "Tonight's our night, man," Ethan said with a grin. "Let's show 'em what we're made of." Darius nodded, his confidence building. For the first time in a while, he felt like things might be okay. But halfway through the game, as Darius dribbled down the court, something caught his eye. In the stands near the back, Zach was sitting with his friends, watching him intently. Darius's heart skipped a beat, the familiar tension returning. He tried to shake it off, focusing on the game. But every time he glanced toward the stands, Zach was there, staring at him with a look that sent a chill down Darius's spine. By the time the game ended, Darius's team had won, but the victory felt hollow. As the players left the court and the crowd began to disperse, Darius felt the weight of Zach's gaze on him. Ethan noticed it too. "You all right?" he asked as they grabbed their bags. "Yeah," Darius said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Just tired." But as they walked toward the exit, Darius spotted Zach and his friends waiting near the gym doors, their faces hard and unfriendly. Ethan tensed beside him. "Let's just keep walking." Darius nodded, but the moment they stepped outside, Zach called after them. "Hey, Morgan, nice game," Zach said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Darius gritted his teeth, trying to keep walking, but he could feel the tension building. He didn't want another confrontation, but Zach seemed determined to push him. "Come on, don't ignore me," Zach taunted, stepping closer. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" Ethan grabbed Darius's arm, pulling him away. "Ignore him, man. He's just trying to start something." But Zach wasn't backing down. "What's the matter, Morgan? Afraid to fight me again?" Darius's blood boiled, but he forced himself to keep moving. He wasn't going to give Zach the satisfaction of a reaction, not this time. As they walked away, Darius could hear Zach's mocking laughter behind them, but he kept his head down, focused on getting as far away from the gym as possible. But deep down, Darius knew this wasn't over. The confrontation with Zach after the basketball game lingered in Darius's mind for days. He tried to move on, to focus on school and basketball, but no matter how hard he tried, Zach's words followed him like a shadow. It wasn't just the taunts or the mocking laughter, it was the way Zach looked at him, like he was waiting for Darius to slip up, to give him another reason to strike. Darius had always prided himself on staying in control, on not letting anger get the best of him. But lately, that control has been slipping. He could feel it every time Zach was nearby, like a slow boil rising in his chest, waiting to explode. One day after school, Darius found himself walking home alone. Ethan had to stay late for a meeting with one of the coaches, and Darius had planned to head straight home, keeping his head down as usual. But as he turned the corner onto his street, he saw them, Zach and his crew, Logan and Matt, leaning against the brick wall of a convenience store waiting. Darius's pulse quickened. He had hoped they would just walk away after the last encounter, but here they were again, determined to push him to the brink. He considered turning around, taking a different route home, but something in him refused to back down. He was tired of feeling cornered, tired of being afraid. He walked forward, his steps deliberate, his jaw clenched. "Look who it is," Zach sneered as Darius approached. "Morgan, the hero. How's it feel to always be the victim?" Darius didn't respond. His eyes locked straight ahead. He tried to walk past them, to ignore the insults, but Zach wasn't going to let him off that easily. "Hey, don't walk away from me," Zach barked, stepping in front of him, blocking his path. "You think you can just ignore me?" Darius's heart raced, his fists clenching at his sides. He could feel the anger rising, the boiling heat that had been simmering for weeks. "I don't want any trouble," Darius said through gritted teeth. Zach laughed, a cruel sound that echoed down the street. "Oh, you don't want trouble. Funny, because everywhere you go, trouble seems to follow." Logan and Matt stood behind Zach, their eyes glinting with anticipation, like they were waiting for the fireworks to start. Darius felt cornered, trapped. His mind raced, trying to find a way out, but every option felt like it would lead to the same outcome. Just let me go, Zach," Darius said, his voice tight. "I'm not looking for a fight." But Zach stepped closer, his smirk fading, his expression hardening into something darker. "Oh, but I am." Before Darius could react, Zach shoved him hard, sending him stumbling backward. His backpack slipped off his shoulder, hitting the ground with a thud. Darius's pulse spiked, the adrenaline surging through him like fire. He had promised himself he wouldn't fight, that he wouldn't let Zach drag him down. But now, as he stood there, fists clenched, heart racing, that promise felt impossible to keep. Zach shoved him again, harder this time, and Darius staggered, barely keeping his balance. "Come on, Morgan," Zach taunted. "Fight back, or are you just going to stand there and take it?" Darius's vision blurred, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The anger was overwhelming now, a flood that threatened to drown him. He knew what would happen if he fought back. He knew the consequences, but in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. All he wanted was to shut Zach up, to make him feel just a fraction of the pain and humiliation he had caused. Zach raised his hand to shove Darius again, but before he could make contact, Darius snapped. With a surge of fury, he swung his fist, connecting with Zach's jaw in a single, powerful punch. Zach stumbled backward, clutching his face, his eyes wide with shock. For a moment, the street was silent. Even Logan and Matt seemed stunned, their smug expressions replaced with uncertainty. Darius's chest heaved, his fists still clenched, his entire body trembling with the force of the blow. He had never hit anyone before, never let himself go this far. But now, standing over Zach, watching him reel from the punch, Darius felt a wave of emotions he couldn't fully understand. Relief, guilt, fear, and something darker. Zach straightened, wiping the blood from his lip with the back of his hand. His eyes blazed with fury. "You're gonna regret that, Morgan." Logan and Matt stepped forward, and for a brief, terrifying moment, Darius thought they were going to jump him. But before anything else could happen, a voice cuts through the tension. "What the hell is going on here?" Darius turned to see Mr. Reynolds, the gym teacher, jogging toward them from across the street, his face a mask of confusion and anger. "Break it up now," he barked. Zach glared at Darius, his hands still clenched into fists, but he didn't move. Logan and Matt stayed back, their expressions hardening into something unreadable. "Get out of here, all of you," Mr. Reynolds ordered. "Now." Without another word, Zach turned and walked away. Logan and Matt followed close behind. As they disappeared down the street, Darius's heart began to slow, the adrenaline fading, leaving him feeling hollow and drained. Mr. Reynolds looked at Darius, his expression stern. "You all right, Morgan?" Darius nodded, though he didn't feel all right. He felt like everything had just come crashing down. "Get home," Mr. Reynolds said, his voice softer now, "and stay out of trouble." Darius nodded again, grabbing his backpack from the ground and slinging it over his shoulder. As he walked home, his mind raced, replaying the moment over and over. The punch, the look on Zach's face, the burning anger in his own chest. He had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. When Darius got home, he went straight to his room, closing the door behind him and sinking onto his bed. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, regret, fear. He had never hit anyone before, never let himself lose control like that, but now that it had happened, he wasn't sure how to feel. Part of him was relieved, even proud, that he had finally stood up to Zach. But another part of him, a deeper part, was scared. Scared of what this would mean. Scared of how far things might go from here. Darius lay back on his bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to calm the storm inside him. But the guilt was there, nagging at him, reminding him that no matter how justified he had felt in that moment, violence wasn't the answer. He had crossed a line, and now he had to face the consequences. A few hours later, there was a knock at his door. Darius sat up, bracing himself for the conversation he knew was coming. "Come in," he said quietly. The door opened, and Greg stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He sat down on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped together as if trying to gather his thoughts. "I heard what happened," Greg said after a long pause. "Mr. Reynolds called." Darius didn't respond. He didn't know what to say. Greg sighed, rubbing his temples. "Darius, I know things have been hard lately. I know Zach's been pushing you, but hitting him, that's not the way to handle this." "I know," Darius muttered, his voice barely above a whisper, "but he wouldn't stop. He kept pushing me, and I couldn't take it anymore." Greg looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of understanding and concern. "I get it. Believe me, I do. But you've got to keep your cool no matter how much someone provokes you. Once you start throwing punches, things escalate and you lose control of the situation." Darius nodded, though the knot in his chest remained. "What's going to happen now?" "I don't know," Greg admitted, "but we'll figure it out. You're not in this alone." Darius wanted to believe that, but deep down, he knew the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, Darius's nerves were on edge as he walked into school. The hallway felt tighter than usual, the air buzzing with energy, and he could feel the weight of eyes on him. The rumors of the fight had spread fast, faster than he could have anticipated. Ethan caught up with him before first period, his expression tense. "I heard about what happened. You okay?" "Yeah," Darius said, though his voice didn't carry the conviction he wanted it to. "I'm fine." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You don't look fine." Darius sighed, running a hand through his hair. I lost it, man. Zach kept pushing and I couldn't take it anymore. Now everyone's talking about it." Ethan nodded, his face serious. "Yeah, they are. But listen, you did what you had to do. Zach's been messing with you for months. I get why you snapped." "Maybe," Darius muttered, though the guilt still gnawed at him. "But it doesn't feel like I won anything." By lunchtime, the buzz in the school had reached a fever pitch. Students whispered and stared as Darius walked through the cafeteria. He could hear bits of conversation as he passed by. "Did you hear about the fight?" Morgan knocked Zach out. "Yeah, I heard Zach's planning something. He's not going to let it go." Darius tried to block it all out, but it was impossible to ignore. The tension in the air was thick, like the whole school was waiting for something to happen. As he sat down with Ethan at their usual table, he caught a glimpse of Zach across the room. Zach was sitting with Logan and Matt, his face bruised from the punch, his expression cold and unreadable. For a moment their eyes met, and Darius felt a chill run down his spine. He could tell Zach wasn't done, not by a long shot. "Just ignore him," Ethan said quietly, noticing Darius's tense expression. "He's not worth it." Darius nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was coming. Zach wasn't the type to back down, and Darius knew that as long as they were both in the same school, the fight wasn't over. 2 days later, the final confrontation came. It was after school, and Darius was walking toward the basketball courts, planning to blow off some steam by shooting hoops. He had been on edge all week, the tension between him and Zach building with every passing day, but he hadn't expected the confrontation to come so soon. As he approached the courts, he saw them, Zach, Logan, and Matt, waiting for him. This time, there were no taunts, no mocking laughter. The look on Zach's face was different now, calm, focused, determined. He wasn't here to play games. Darius stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the adrenaline kicking in, his muscles tensing, his mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts. But before he could say anything, Zach spoke. "This ends today, Morgan," Zach said, his voice low and cold. "No more games, no more talking." Darius's fists clenched at his sides, the anger bubbling up again. He was tired of this, tired of being cornered, tired of being pushed. But he also knew that another fight wasn't the answer. "Zach, just let it go," Darius said, his voice firm. "This doesn't have to go any further." But Zach wasn't listening. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on Darius. "You think you can just walk away? After everything? After you hit me?" Darius's pulse quickened, the tension crackling in the air. He didn't want this fight, not again. But he could see it in Zach's eyes. There was no way to talk him down. "You made your choice," Zach said, his voice growing louder. "Now I'm making mine." And with that, Zach lunged. Zach lunged at Darius with a ferocity that took him by surprise. For a moment, everything seemed to blur. The world narrowed down to Zach's fists, his rage, and the sheer force of the moment. Darius barely had time to react before Zach's fist connected with his shoulder, sending a sharp jolt of pain through his body. The anger that Darius had fought so hard to suppress roared back to life, and for a split second, he considered fighting back, throwing a punch and letting all the frustration and hurt explode in one final blow. But something inside him hesitated. His father's words echoed in his mind. "Violence only leads to more violence." Zach swung again, and this time Darius dodged, his instincts telling him to defend himself. But he still didn't fight back. His fists clenched tightly at his sides, his chest heaving with the effort of holding himself in check. "Come on," Zach snarled, his voice hoarse with anger. "Fight me, Morgan. You're not getting out of this." Darius backed away, his eyes darting around the empty basketball court. No one was around to stop them. No teachers, no classmates. Just him, Zach, and the two boys standing off to the side, watching with cold detachment. He knew he couldn't rely on anyone else to stop this. He had to find a way to end it himself. "Zach, this isn't the way," Darius said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. "I'm not going to fight you." Zach's face twisted in frustration, his fists still raised, ready for a fight. "You're a coward. That's what you are. You think you're so high and mighty, but you're just scared." Darius shook his head. "I'm not scared of you, Zach. I'm scared of what happens if this keeps going." For a moment, Zach just stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes locked on Darius with a mixture of rage and confusion. Darius could see the tension in his posture, the anger boiling just beneath the surface. But he also saw something else, something more vulnerable, a flicker of uncertainty. Logan and Matt shifted uncomfortably behind Zach, exchanging glances as if unsure of what to do next. They had been expecting a fight, but now, with Darius refusing to engage, the energy in the air felt strange, tense but unfulfilled. Zach stepped closer, his fists still clenched, but his movements were slower now, less certain. "You don't get it, do you?" he muttered. "You don't get what it's like." Darius stared at him, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Zach let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You think you're the only one with problems? The only one dealing with crap? You've got everyone on your side, your dad, the principal, the whole school's talking about how you're some kind of hero. But no one gives a damn about me." Darius blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift in Zach's tone. He had never thought of Zach as anything other than a bully, someone who thrived on making others feel small. But now, hearing the pain in Zach's voice, Darius realized there was more going on beneath the surface. "I didn't know," Darius said quietly. "But hurting other people isn't going to make it better." Zach clenched his jaw, his fists trembling. "You don't know what it's like to be invisible, to feel like you don't matter." Darius took a step forward, lowering his hands. "You're right. I don't know what you're going through, but this isn't the way to deal with it." For a long moment, Zach didn't say anything. His fists slowly unclenched, his shoulders sagging as the adrenaline began to fade. The anger in his eyes dimmed, replaced by something heavier, exhaustion maybe, or even regret. Logan and Matt exchanged another glance, then turned to Zach. "Come on, man," Logan said quietly. "Let's get out of here." Zach didn't move at first. He just stood there, staring at Darius as if trying to decide what to do next. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, he took a step back. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, then turned and walked away without another word. Logan and Matt followed him, and within seconds, they were gone. Darius stood there for a moment, the silence of the empty court pressing in around him. His heart was still pounding, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline, but he hadn't fought. He hadn't let the anger win. That night, Darius sat at the dinner table with his parents, feeling the weight of everything that had happened over the past few months settle over him. He had managed to avoid another fight with Zach, but the emotional toll had been enormous. He felt drained, like he had been carrying a heavy weight on his shoulders for too long. Lisa set a plate of food in front of him, her eyes full of concern. "You've been quiet all evening. Do you want to talk about what happened?" Darius looked down at his plate, poking at the food with his fork. "I don't know. It's just a lot." Greg leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Did something happen with Zach today?" Darius hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, we almost fought again, but I didn't fight him." Lisa and Greg exchanged a glance, relief flickering in their eyes. "That's good, Darius," Greg said gently. "You made the right choice." "I don't know if it was the right choice," Darius muttered. "I feel like, I don't know, like nothing's really changed. Zach's still angry. People still treat me differently, and I don't know how to fix it." Lisa reached across the table, placing her hand over Darius's. "Sweetheart, you can't control how other people act, but you can control how you respond. You've shown strength by not letting anger control you. That's something to be proud of." Darius nodded, though the weight in his chest hadn't fully lifted. He knew his parents were right, but it still felt like there was so much left unresolved. He had spent so long feeling like he was constantly on the defensive, constantly fighting just to exist, and now he wasn't sure what to do next. "Maybe it's not about fixing everything right away," Greg added. "Maybe it's about taking things one step at a time." Darius looked up at his dad, something softening inside him. For the first time in a long while, he felt a small glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The next day at school, things were different. Not drastically, but enough that Darius noticed the subtle shift in the way people looked at him. The whispers had quieted, the stares lessened. The fight that everyone had been waiting for hadn't happened, and that seemed to change the narrative. Zach didn't approach him again. In fact, Darius barely saw him at all. It was as if something had shifted in Zach too. Something that had made him realize that the fight wasn't worth it anymore. Darius didn't know for sure, but he was grateful for the silence. Ethan noticed the change too. "Looks like Zach's finally backed off," he said one day at lunch, glancing around the cafeteria. "Maybe he realized he's not going to win this one." Darius shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe. Or maybe he just got tired." Ethan grinned. "Either way, I'm glad things are settling down." The rest of the week passed without incident, and by Friday, Darius felt like he could finally breathe again. He had never imagined that things would get this bad, but now that the storm had passed, he was beginning to feel hopeful. He had made it through the worst of it, and while there were still challenges ahead, he knew he was stronger now. Weeks later, life at Hamilton Middle School returned to a new kind of normal. The tension that had defined the past few months had faded, replaced with a sense of calm that Darius hadn't felt in a long time. Darius had found new strength in himself, and while the pain and struggles he had endured hadn't disappeared, they had shaped him into someone more resilient, more capable of handling whatever came next. One afternoon, after basketball practice, Darius sat on the bleachers, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Ethan was beside him, sipping on a bottle of water, both of them basking in the quiet of the empty gym. "You know," Ethan said, breaking the silence, "I think you handled all of this way better than I would have." Darius laughed softly. "I don't know about that." "I'm serious," Ethan said, his voice sincere. "You've been through a lot, man, and you didn't let it break you." Darius thought about that for a moment. He hadn't come out of this unscathed, far from it, but he hadn't let the anger consume him. He hadn't let Zach or anyone else define who he was. He had made his own choices, and he had chosen to fight with words, not fists. "Thanks," Darius said quietly, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "I guess I'm still figuring things out." Ethan grinned. "Aren't we all?" They sat there for a while longer, watching as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, leaving the gym in soft shadows. For the first time in what felt like forever, Darius felt at peace. In the months that followed, Darius continued to navigate the ups and downs of middle school life. There were still challenges, still moments when the weight of everything he had gone through felt heavy on his shoulders, but now he knew how to carry it. The experience with Zach had taught him valuable lessons, not just about standing up for himself, but about understanding that people's actions are often fueled by pain and insecurity. It didn't excuse Zach's behavior, but it gave Darius a new perspective, one that helped him approach future conflicts with more compassion and strength. One evening, Darius sat at his desk, working on an essay for his English class. The topic was, "What Makes a Hero?" As he wrote, his mind drifted back to everything that had happened, the fight with Zach, the struggles he had faced, the decisions he had made. He realized that being a hero wasn't about winning fights or proving your strength. It was about making choices that reflected who you wanted to be, even when it was hard. It was about standing up for what was right, even when no one else was watching. And perhaps most importantly, it was about staying true to yourself. As he finished the essay, Darius smiled to himself. He wasn't perfect, and he still had a lot to learn, but he was proud of the person he was becoming. And as he looked ahead to the future, Darius knew that whatever challenges came his way, he was ready. Thank you for joining us on Darius's journey of resilience, strength, and hope. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We have more stories like this about overcoming obstacles, standing up for what's right, and finding the courage to be yourself. Your support means the world to us, and together we can continue to spread messages of positivity, unity, and empowerment. Leave a comment below, share your thoughts, your own experiences, or simply say hello. We'd love to hear from you. Stay tuned for more inspiring stories, and remember, you're never alone in your journey. Subscribe now and let's build a community of strength and support.